As far as my teacher voice is concerned, I lost that about 10 years ago. Probably about 2 years before I quit teaching. And the last semester I taught, I had pneumonia, so I couldn't even speak.
Really?
Yeah, I had walking pneumonia. I had to keep going because it would have messed up my retirement. So for if it killed me, I had to teach for a month with pneumonia, I could hardly speak, and my students were all hushing each other up so they could hear me. That's how bad it was. I was on the second floor of the nursing building, and I always walked up the second floor. Well, I got so sick I couldn't walk up the second floor. I had to take an elevator. I couldn't lift my briefcase, but I couldn't quit. If I quit, I said it would have messed up my retirement completely. So, as you can see, I survived. Anyway, we were on page 363 of the notes that you don't have. That's in the reality chapter by Father Garrigou-Lagrange. I can't get it. Garrigou-Lagrange. Nobody should have a name like that. Anyway, we are on the right-hand page, which is 363. And I've always eschewed going into any theological topics in this class, but what Father Lagrange has here is clearly theological in content, because he's talking about the ability of the human mind, the human intellect, to know God. And specifically, the problem is this. He says, since every created faculty is specifically constituted by its own proper object, so the power of sight is ordered to color, for example. The power of the intellect is ordered to being. But he says the difficulty we have is that no created intellect can be specifically proportioned to the proper object of divine intelligence. So divinity, as it is in itself, is inaccessible to created intelligence. And here we do have a clearly problem, because in the natural order, one of the ways that we know that man has God as his last end is because we have a natural desire to know. And human beings have a natural desire to know the causes of things. And that's why the mind is led back from the finite things in the world around us, ultimately to God as the first cause, uncaused. And our mind wants to know this. The intellect seeks to know this. But the problem is that we're never satisfied with simply knowing there's a cause. We're never satisfied with knowing what we can know of the cause by reason of the effects. And as a matter of fact, you know from having done some natural theology that we don't know a great deal about God in himself by reason of causality. We know that he is infinite, which means he's not finite. We know that he's the cause of the things the world around us, but that tells us only that he is the cause. We know that he's immaterial, but that's because we know what matter is. Our problem is that we don't know what he is in himself, and the intellect naturally desires to understand things in themselves. Now, of course, the solution to this, if you have led a good life, after you die, you can attain what is known as the beatific vision. But the difficulty is that the beatific vision means the attainment of God in his very essence. And what Father Lagrange has just pointed out, as St. Thomas points out, is that the human intellect is simply not proportioned to the divine essence as its proper object. There's a lack of proportion. So how can this be done? Yes?
Is he saying there, in other words, that we can know God indirectly through effects and through analogy of
That's right.
nature?
That's right. Well, that's what we know we can do from natural theology.
Right.
The problem is that this is not satisfying. to the mind. We want to know what something is in itself. And if we could never do that, there would be an insufficiency in terms of attaining our last end. So how then is the beatific vision possible? The finite intellect, in other words, lacks an active potency to know God's essence. By active potency here, what we're referring to is something like the intellect has as its proper object the nature of the things in the world around us. And it can know them. We have an active potency. We have a power that can do that. We have a power that's ordered to vegetation, and we can do that. We have powers that are ordered to sensation, and we can do that. But we don't have a power by nature that is ordered to the actual understanding of the divine essence. So it isn't just a matter of revving up our nature. It isn't in our nature. The only way that we can therefore attain the divine essence as an object of understanding is if God somehow directly elevates our very being in some sense. Now, as he says, he refers to what's called an obediential potency. We've never talked about that before, never seen it before. And of course, you can kind of get some sense of what it means just by the words. It means a potency to do, really, what God orders the creature to do. And probably the most immediate obediential potency that I can think of is the potency to be created. We didn't always exist. The world didn't always exist. God calls forth being, presupposing nothing. Notice I don't say from non-being. From non-being, you never get being. Creation is an act by which God, from his being, posits in existence the creature. And there is a kind of obediential potency there, because it's possible, and God wills it, and thus it is done. So he refers to an obediential potency, and I don't even say this is in the same order, because in the case of creation, there's nothing to work with, to start with, except God's own power. In this case, at least, the creature does exist. We do exist. Intellective beings do exist. So there is an obediential potency in the creature by which the creature is capable of elevation to the supernatural order. And he says this is passive, not active. It's not an active potency. An active potency would be a power. Were it otherwise, this potency, this capability of knowing God's essence, would be both essentially natural as a property of nature, because that's what all our natural powers are. They belong to our nature. They're essentially natural. But at the same time, it would be supernatural, because it would be specifically constituted by a supernatural object. So it can't be both natural and supernatural at the same time and in the same respect. The supernatural object would be that to which our nature would be essentially proportioned, but it isn't. It's essentially proportioned to natural objects, such as the good, such as being, such as truth, understanding, the various sense objects. The word obediential relates this potency to the agent which alone can raise it to a supernatural object. In other words, God. God is the only being that can dictate, elevate our nature so that it becomes proportioned or raised to a supernatural object. And don't ask me how he does this. No, it would help to be God, if you want to understand this. without that elevation, it can never be related and proportioned. So here again, what are we talking about all the way through here? We're talking about act and potency. So here you have a very special kind of potency, because it's not in the natural order that an intellective creature should know God in his essence. That can only be done by the direct elevation by God. And of course, we would not know that was possible except by divine revelation. So that's why we are into theology here, like it or not. And he says, here lies the distinction between the two orders. And this is interesting. The theological virtues, the two orders it refers to would be the natural and the supernatural. The theological virtues are per se infused directly from God because they are specifically constituted by a supernatural object. The theological virtues are per se infused because they are specifically constituted by a supernatural object, which means simply without grace they are inaccessible. Without grace, gratia, the help specifically of God, they could not be attained. But again, why are we talking about this? Because it's an instance of understanding the relationship between act and potency. And we're trying to understand what kind of a potency is required in order to have knowledge of God's essence in himself. It's not in our nature to do that. That's the point. It can only be done by a direct act by God upon us, elevating us to that act. Again, how do we do that? Not by any natural power of our own. That's why we talk about the theological virtues as being infused from God. And again, to go further into theology, he says, revelation admitted. In other words, we're talking in terms of revelation. The real distinction between potency and act which is a distinction between finite essence and the act of existence. Remember, essence is potency, existence is act. Now he's going to apply this to Christ. Just as there is one person in the two natures, the divine and human nature, so there is likewise one existence for those two natures. So in Christ, in the divine and the human nature, both have the same act of existence. The difference, of course, is the divine nature is identical to the act of existence because in God there's no distinction between essence and existence. In the creature, that is in the human nature of Christ, there is distinction between the essence and existence. But the existence is not a created existence, it is God himself. The Word, that is the second person of the Blessed Trinity, communicates his own existence to his human nature. And he gives an example, but always be careful of his examples. He says, as the separated soul, when it resumes its body, gives to that body its own existence. So again, we're talking about act and potency, how it would apply in the case of Christ in terms of the act of existence, which is God himself, because you can't distinguish in God between existence and essence. You can't do it. It's the term of that divine being, which is the second person. And that again, we've discussed that before in some detail. But from the standpoint of Christ's human nature, that is a creature whose act, that is, act of existence, is God himself as the second person of the Trinity. I know this is not terribly easy. But again, you've got a relationship of potency in terms of the human nature of Christ to act, namely the divine existence, which is the esse, the existence of that particular potency. And then if you think that's difficult enough, then he goes on to the Trinity, where there are three persons in one sole, uncreated existence, existence itself, which in that case is identified with the divine nature. Remember, in the Trinity, the divine nature is identical, the divine essence is identical with the act of existence, which is not the case in any creature. Any questions here?
For me, I wish you could put it in terms, simple terms, to be able to understand it. I'm following you reading it, but
Yeah.
when you keep using these terms over and again, existence and potency,
Yeah.
I'm being flooded.
Well, you know, the difficulty, sister, is that whenever people always say, well, give me an example. Because, you know, we want an example we can understand. Unfortunately, when you're dealing with these things, if I give you an example, it probably would mislead you, because there aren't any examples. You can't say it's like this or like that, it's something in ordinary experience, because it's not like anything in ordinary experience. I'm not saying it's impossible to give an example, but that's my fear in terms of trying to give an example. It's like in the fourth way, St. Thomas says, he says, like, fire is the hottest of all things. Well, it turns out he borrowed it from the Platonic cosmology, and it wasn't even true. It was a terrible example. And it turns out the only example of what he's talking about was what he was talking about. So there isn't another example. Give me another example for the Trinity. What do you want, the shamrock? I mean, it doesn't work too well, in truth. I mean, it's a good symbol. But when you look very closely at it, it doesn't really express what you're trying to say. So I don't know how to make this really more simple, except to realize that we are dealing with act and potency, and that in the case of God, there is no distinction between act and potency, because in God you have pure act. So anything you see in the relationship, for example, to Christ, that's why we say Christ's human nature is a creature. His divine nature is not a creature. So as far as the human nature is concerned, can be a composition between his nature or essence and his existence, just as there is in us. The difference is that in us, our act of existence is a created act of existence. Our essence is created, our existence is created. In Christ, his human nature is created, but his existence is God. Because his existence is the existence of God, and in God, existence and essence are identical. And this is the only way in which one can understand why it's absolutely legitimate to say he is God. Not like God, not some kind of a perfect creature, but the very existence which constitutes his person is divine. But in God, in the Trinity, of course, all you have is pure act. There is no potency. Potencies exist on the part of creatures. They don't exist in God. You might say, well, didn't he have the potency to create? And then he created? Be careful, that's another one of those things where you're shoving God into time. God is utterly outside of time. And in him, his life is eternity, in which everything that is simultaneously. But that word simultaneously is a no good word, isn't it? Because it means all at the same time. That's for us stupid humans. It's the only way we can express it. God's existence, his life, takes place all at the same time. So for him, there is no distinction between before he created the world and after he created the world. That's a distinction for you and me. That's a distinction for the world. The world had a potency, which was actualized by being created. And the world had a beginning. And in the world, there's a difference between before it was and when it was. But in God, it's all simultaneous. Or better said, it is simply eternal. This is why, and I don't really understand fully what I'm saying here, but I begin to get a little bit more of an insight. When we talk about dying and going into eternity, we really are, we've got one foot in eternity. I don't know exactly how to put it, because you're in eternity and there are sequences of events. But the reason that you can't change the game after you have entered it is because you are locked into eternity itself. And there's nothing that's going to change. You might, that's why I suspect we think about, well, what we will be doing one day after another, for all eternity. We're going to visit Neptune and Mars on one day, or plan a picnic on Alpha Centauri. I have a suspicion that's not how it is. I have a suspicion that it is all at once, and that it is an unchanging, permanent state. And that's why if you're in heaven, you're in it. And unfortunately, if you're not, it's not a question of getting a get out of hell card at some point, because that you're in it too, and that's an unchanging state. You are literally in eternity. And this is why you're not waiting for, planning 10,000 years from now we'll have a picnic on Balboa Island or something. That simply isn't part of it. You enter into that condition of being which is all at once, but which we can't understand because we are creatures of time. We're limited by time and our very conceptualization of things. So we don't even have good words for eternity. Yes?
I know it's a repetition, but could you please explain the difference between essence and existence?
Essence is what a thing is. It's the structure of a being, which in every creature means you're describing the limitations of the way it exists. And the existence is the act by which that essence actually is, as opposed to being nothing, or as opposed to being a mere potentiality of some sort. So in every creature, you immediately have said there's a distinction between existence and essence, between act and potency. And that's why, of course, it gets very intriguing when you then try to figure out how to explain the nature of Christ, who is simultaneously eternity itself, and yet whose human nature, not the divine nature, but whose human nature is a creature and shares the same nature that we have.
Including change.
Pardon me?
Including change.
Including change, right. I think one has to always remember that everything we know from just the little bit of sense experience that we have in the short lives we've had. So we're trying to describe things that are truly beyond our pay grade in the extreme. So anyway, to continue. Such are the consequences of the distinction between potency and act. first in the natural order, then in the supernatural order. Here, Father Lagrange is referring to everything we've covered in the previous 3 classes. As we started out looking at act and potency in the most ordinary things of the world, and here we've worked our way up to considering act and potency in relationship to God himself. Now, how, Joe? Oh, how binding are these definitions that we've been studying, and known as the 24 Theses? He says the supreme authority, and he's referring there to Pope Benedict XV, does not intend these theses to be definitions of faith, but simply declarations of the doctrine preferred by the Church. So it's not a matter of faith that one has to hold these 24 theses. Nevertheless, the more that, at least I look at them, the more I realize if you deviate from them, as Pius X warns us, especially in metaphysics, you get in a whole peck of trouble. Isn't that what the translation says?
Whole peck of trouble.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Exactly.
Without grave disadvantage.
Oh, okay. Without grave disadvantage. Maybe the word grave is even more appropriate. And there's a lot of people, of course, who try to do that. And this is the problem that arose is, okay, so we're supposed to be Thomists, or at least that's what's preferred and recommended by the Church, but what does it mean to be a Thomist? And that's why these 24 Theses came out. Can a man be called a Thomist by the mere fact that he admits the dogmas defined by the Church? This is under a section entitled Forgetting the 24 Theses. In other words, what happens if you don't have them? Can you be a Thomist just because you follow the doctrines of the Church? Well, he says, you follow the doctrines of the Church, but at the same time, this fellow follows Descartes in his teachings on the spiritual life, or he denies the evident principle of causality and hence the validity of the proof for the existence of God. In other words, can you call yourself a Thomist and hold any doctrines that you want? And of course, this is the whole point of the 24 Theses. It's a way of defining who is authentically a Thomist. Because there were all sorts of people running around saying, I'm a Thomist, but what did they actually hold? They held things that were tremendously damaging. That this is holding the doctrines, but denying the rational foundations for them is what we call fideism, from the Latin fides, meaning faith. It's pure faith, which is, of course, typical of a Protestant theology, not the Catholic one. And what we will see more and more is that these 24 theses, these basic theses of being and knowledge, are essential to accepting and understanding the content of doctrine. They're not unrelated. That's the point he's trying to make here. You can't just say, well, I'm accepting the doctrine, but I can hold some other philosophy. If you deviate from these principles, especially in metaphysics, what will inevitably occur, as far as I can tell, is you wind up mutilating the doctrine, denying or destroying the doctrine in some way.
In that sense, where does Duns Scotus fit in all this?
Close, but he's not a Thomist.
So is that good or bad?
Well, that's why I don't think that the Holy Fathers wanted to condemn all of the great medieval theologians. But what they were saying is that the safest road to follow is that which was laid down by these 24 Theses of St. Thomas, which really weren't his theses, but a rendition of them made by people in the early part of the 20th century. So that he certainly wouldn't want to condemn Duns Scotus or Cajetan.
Just in a word, would Scotus be close to this in thinking, or
He'd be very close. He'd be very close, but he's got a very different way of stating things. The problem.
I was just going to say, also, we don't have SCOTUS respond here to follow the 24 Theses. He's operating without these guidelines. So it's hard to say what he would do if these guidelines were,
Well,
had been there in his day.
well, that's true too. But I mean, there are a lot of great medieval theologians and philosophers. Nobody's trying to condemn them. But one of the things you'll notice, for example, we'll mention it later about Cajetan. Cajetan was great in his own right, but he tried to very faithfully follow St. Thomas. And I'll come to him in a few minutes. So, very famous principle. A small error in principle is a great error in conclusion. This is something can never be overstated. I think it's found in the De Ante et Essentia, in the Proemium. And I remember Dr. Waters and I were always trying to look up where it was, and we'd scout all over the place. That you'd naturally think it would be in the Metaphysics, but it turns out to be in the De Ante, I believe, in the beginning, the introduction, the Proemium. But it's a critical point. A small error in principle. If you're aiming at the moon from Earth, and you are only 1 degree off when you leave Earth, guess where you're going to wind up? You miss the moon. You can't do any worse than that. And that we see happen all the time. A little tiny error. How about Suarez? Remember? He's got a concept of active potency where he puts the act in the potency. And what does that lead to? By the time you get into the hands of people like Hegel and Bergson, you're into process philosophy. It leads to denial of the proofs for God's existence, because things could move themselves, really, all by themselves. Little tiny error. All you're doing is just saying, well, potency's got a little bit of act in it, just a little bit. But that little bit of act means it simultaneously is not because it's potential, but it is because it's actual. You put a contradiction right in your starting point. And heaven help you thereafter. All of the implications that are manifested later on are huge. And remember, I always am reminded and impressed with the fact that this reduces down to the simplest stuff. All the way back down to Parmenides, remember? Being and non-being. It's that simple. Potency's on the side of non-being. If you confuse being with non-being, you wind up with becoming, as Hegel does, and you wind up in process philosophy, along with Bergson and Teilhard de Chardin. And what does that do to things like dogma? You got dogma in a state of becoming. That's cute. So we have had some people argue development of dogma means that what is asserted in one period is denied in another. There's a legitimate development of dogma, but it never means contradicting what was said before. It may mean further specification of what was said before, never contradicting. But some people have taken development of dogma to mean you can reverse it. And if you are in a process philosophy, what does that do to the stability of dogma? What does it do to essences? This is a fight going back to Heraclitus and Parmenides, Heraclitus and Aristotle. One of the big arguments and objections of the evolutionists is that Aristotle was talking about essences that were permanent, stuck, stable, static. Evolutionism doesn't have anything static. Everything's becoming and changing. So biologists like Ernst Mayr condemn the notion of the Aristotelian essence because he conceives of it as something that freezes reality so that things are absolutely identical from one step to another and don't really change. And I can understand how somebody can make that mistake. Remember, the essences that we have in common, what we have in common is understood by the mind, but it's based on an abstraction. So every one of us has an intellect, but we've all got our own intellect. Everybody has knowledge in his intellect, but we all have different knowledge in different intellects. They're not exactly the same in that way, but they are the same in that you can predicate a common nature of them. It's what we call a common essence with a fundamentum in re, a foundation in reality. There's a basis for the community of things. But that doesn't mean that they're frozen and static the way that some of these biologists thought, or the way that Bergson would accuse the traditional philosophers of being. It's understandable that people would get confused about this, but this is why if you put a kind of process philosophy in the very foundation of things, you can't wed that to the notion of Christian dogma, because dogma means something stays permanent. Once it's defined, it remains defined. It doesn't get changed. So they view that as anathema to their process philosophy. And if you identify evolution with evolutionism, if you move from a scientific theory of some sort to a metaphysical doctrine, then you make it impossible. You set up a wall between what looks like a contradiction between science and theology that could never be bridged. And of course it's because there's a misunderstanding here. But the misunderstanding goes all the way back to Parmenides and Heraclitus and Aristotle and the notion of analogy and so forth. So, but again, if you're off just a little in the foundation, everything else goes off. And that's why he says the basic truths of metaphysics are prior to all kinds of philosophies. These truths need to be defended today, he says, against phenomenalists, idealists, absolute evolutionists. He says we must penetrate to their philosophic depths. Every philosophy, sometimes people say, well, aren't there a lot of philosophies? Well, there may be a number of philosophies, but if they aren't grounded ultimately in these first principles of being, you don't know what they say. What do they mean? I mean, we hear about existentialism, phenomenology, logical positivism, all of the stuff that's running around existentialism today. But most of these, what they're doing is they've taken some particular insight and they've built the whole of their philosophy on that insight, which is a partial insight. For the positivist, it's the assumption that everything is known through the senses and by science. Logical positivists throw in a big dose of logic in it. Existentialism focuses upon the subjectivity of the knower and of the self and of his history. I am my history. Somebody like Jean-Paul Sartre doesn't really ask where do we come from. He says we're just thrown into existence. Well, wait a minute. There's some metaphysical questions I'd like to ask about this.
Go through us.
Well, you're just here. It's funny, though, because when you scratch under the surface, he flips back kind of into a materialistic way of looking at things. But all these philosophies presuppose a context which they don't examine. It's the basic presuppositions that are not even noticed. And that's why you see that so typically today the scientific materialists who will make all kinds of grand assertions about the universe and what we can know and what we can't know, but they don't realize they're using these first metaphysical principles in an absolute way, and they have to, or they can't even say what they're saying. And yet they come up with a nonsense of saying that the study of subatomic physics demonstrates that the principle of non-contradiction is false. Well, gosh, you can't even say those words without presupposing that it's true. If I say something is false, I have affirmed that that is the case, that it's false and it is not true, and that falsity and truth are not the same. Well, that's the principle of non-contradiction. So how do you get those words out of your mouth? The principle of non-contradiction is false. That's a good one. Try that one. But these philosophies invariably presuppose things that they don't tell you. And that's why they usually just start with some kind of an insight, which may be very valid. And that's why each of these modern philosophies have something to contribute. They give you insights, they give you a system, they give you a way of looking at the world, and much of that is of great value. But unfortunately, in so doing, they've thrown out the baby with the bathwater because they've lost the really Thomistic foundation, the Aristotelian Thomistic a prioris of everything. And the most important parts of it are, first of all, those metaphysical first principles that everybody uses to think and to be and to act and to live and to do science with and to do philosophy with. Can't do it without them. And at the other end, the proofs for God's existence, which can only be had if you use those principles effectively. It's that you throw out the principles, that is the sense you deny them, then of course at the other end they don't know how to prove God's existence, so they may think that God does not exist because they've thrown away the very principles that are necessary to demonstrate his existence. So it is critical to understand these basic theses are foundational to all legitimate human knowledge. It can't be overstated. It's not just a particular starting point. And the distinction between potency and act, as we said in the very first couple classes, is not merely an hypothesis. It is necessary. That's why we spent a lot of time proving that the distinction is real. It's not just an assumption that Aristotle makes. And because it is real, all true philosophy must conform to it. Yes, sometimes we say, well, can't you just have philosophy that's just common sense? So some have said that Thomism is, I remember as a graduate student, some people are saying Thomism is just pedantic common sense. Well, it is common sense, but I would rather call it sophisticated common sense. If your common sense tells you something, or if you come to some conclusion that violates common sense, you probably have a problem. If your philosophy tells you that you're the only thing that exists and nothing else exists, you've got a problem. If your philosophy tells you you can't know the things in the world around you, I think you've got a problem. If your philosophy can't tell you where you ever came from, that you're just here by some fiat, you've got a problem. If your philosophy tells you that you're not free and not responsible for your actions, I think you've got a problem. Now, any philosophy that's going to be realistic has to deal with these givens of common sense. But as Father Lagrange says, his common sense is fortified by a deep analysis of man's first notions and man's first principles. Otherwise, having deserted St. Thomas, we may find ourselves in the poor encampment of Thomas Reid. Thomas Reid was a Scotch philosopher of, I think, the early 18th century who had what was called a common sense philosophy. He just reduced it all to common sense. It sounded so good that when I was going to do my doctoral dissertation, I went to the man who became my director, Dr. Joseph Bobick, and I said, could I do a dissertation on Thomas Reid? Because, boy, I was looking for something easy. I wanted something really, and for some reason he wasn't impressed. And instead he turned around and gave me the dissertation topic I walked out with, which was not really what I had in mind. And instead he forced me into the very center of Thomistic metaphysics for the next 10 years. Thank you. But then, if I had done Thomas Reid, I don't know if anybody actually can get a doctorate in Thomas Reid, but he's
Now you can.
You probably can, yes. But this, well, that's why he refers to it as the poor encampment, because there's nothing under it. It's common sense, but nothing but common sense. I'm going over to the next page here on page 365, which you don't have. And he's talking about the papal condemnations by St. Pius X against modernism, and it pertains to what we're doing here. Papal condemnation has brought to light in many Catholic theologians a gaping void, a lack of philosophy. How could that be? I remember when I was at the University of Dayton running into one of my colleagues in the theology department who told me he was proud of the fact that he had never, ever had a course in philosophy. Not a single course in philosophy. This is so utterly unthinkable for a theologian. All of the great theologians of the medieval period and since then are, first of all, good philosophers, sound philosophers. And that's why, you look at their writings and are you looking at a theologian or a philosopher? Well, you're looking at both. Garrigou-Lagrange was a fantastic philosopher and a fantastic theologian. St. Thomas was both a philosopher and a theologian. It's only we today who specialize say, I'm only a philosopher, I'm only a theologian. But you can't be a competent theologian without being minimally competent in philosophy. And unfortunately, we have too many today who are incompetent in philosophy. And that renders them incompetent in theology, ipso facto, although they don't know it. So anyway, here he's talking about, I believe he's referring to an article that he himself wrote in 1929. This would be Father Lagrange. He's talking about these theologians who don't have philosophy. He says, they shared the positivistic disdain for metaphysical speculation. And that is so true. Sometimes they proclaimed a highly questionable fideism. There is hidden behind this theological formation without philosophy, usually if you want to talk about a common sense philosophy, it's just a hidden positivism. It's a matter of conforming everything to what we know from science. This is what you see today in the ethicists who are in various hospitals, for example, on advisory boards. They don't even call themselves ethicians anymore. They're ethicists. Well, what do they turn out to be? They turn out to be utilitarians. They're pragmatists. But how do they determine what is right or wrong? Well, you study the biology, the medical information pertinent to a given problem, and just do whatever seems to be the best, produce the best outcome. But you are then you're determining your ethics by what the science has told you. And it really has to be the other way around. You have to have ethical principles, and then the scientist illuminates those principles, but you apply those principles to what the scientist can tell you. You never violate the principle in the name of some scientific finding. So if you find that you have some kind of a medical solution that saves somebody's life, you don't say it's ethical because it saves his life. You determine whether it was ethical to use that solution, even if it doesn't save it, even if you don't save a life in the process. It may be that the only thing that you can do is something completely unethical. I mean, if you're taking a heart transplant, we've talked about this before in ethics, if I have to carve your heart out when I'm not sure you're dead yet in order to give it to somebody else, sure, I'll save the other person's life, but I committed homicide in the process. They don't call the transplant people the ghoul squad for nothing. Remember, the heart's got to be warm and dripping. They're dearly great questions about whether you're really gone yet. Anyway, he says, fashion led them, that's these theologians, to ridicule philosophy, to jeer at its vocabulary. I've run into people like this. They literally jeer at philosophy. And of course, invariably, they are, the ones I was running into were all process theologians and process philosophers. So they would disdain Aristotle. Why? Because they view him as having a static view of reality. And at a simplistic level, it's easy to see why they would say that. From a positivistic standpoint, there aren't any essences. Nothing is stable. Everything is gradually changing one thing into another. You can't classify anything. But of course, that's one of the problems. What happens to science when you can't classify? You have no science. This leads them to contrast its infatuated audacity with the modesty of scientific hypotheses. What he's talking about here is these modernistic theologians accuse traditional philosophers and theologians of having an infatuated audacity. In other words, claiming things to be true or to be false, as opposed to, they would say, the modesty of scientific hypotheses. In other words, they say, from our perspective, we're not so sure that abortion is always wrong. It depends on the circumstances. You have to approach these situations with a loving heart, seeking to do what will produce the greatest good for the greatest people, the greatest number of people. And without being so sure ahead of time of what is right and what is wrong. Well, it makes it sound like you're being very modest and humble, and you're accepting the latest findings of modern science, and it's got a lot going for it. But the problem is that these people have utterly cast away ethical principles at all. They don't have any principles. That's why it's, again, a friend of mine, a colleague of mine in Dayton, wrote this article on situation ethics in which he said, I am a situationistician, and what this means is I don't have any ethical principles. All right, well, if he wants to say that, I won't, if I said that to people, they'd want to sue me, usually. He said it of himself, but he was right. He had no principles, because a principle means you got some kind of a universal truth, and you're always going to hold it. And you don't give up on it. You don't say abortion is always wrong, except when it's really inconvenient. You don't say, you can never kill anybody, but, unless the circumstances are right. And of course, that's why they love to say, well, we allow exceptions to the rules. But the problem is they don't understand the rule. So they'll say, for example, in the case of capital punishment, that you're making that an exception to the rule of thou shalt not kill. But the rule, as you know, is thou shalt not do murder. And murder is the unjust and unauthorized taking of an innocent human life. That doesn't apply to some serial killer on death row. But they make it sound like it does. The Pope, by describing and synthesizing the modernist error, compelled theology to re-examine not so much particular problems. In other words, he wasn't telling them, go back and work out the particular problems. He's saying, rather, go back to the fundamental religious notions. Get them right. Get your foundations right. Because those had been, as he says, so skillfully distorted by the school of innovators. What they had done is to take Thomism and turn it into something it wasn't, turn it into something that was indefensible. To talk about it as being kind of a blind adherence to principles that has no correspondence to the real world, that is forever evolving and changing and becoming. I mean, if you want me to do a song and dance sounding like a modernist or sounding like one of these process philosophers, I know their game. I know how they can sound. And it sounds kind of convincing if you don't know anything. Because it sounds like it's tied into a changing world and real people who are suffering and having crises of conscience that they shouldn't even be suffering. And they're simply saying, let's apply what we know from natural science today. And of course, they want to conform. If there's a conflict between natural science and theology, guess who's got to give? It's the theology. As the natural science is taken as an absolute. That's why you have people running around today saying Adam and Eve are impossible. Why? Because we got this study that was done back in 1995 by one guy who said, according to his explanation, it was impossible. Having studied studies, I finally decided studies are not very good. You have to be very careful of studies. Anytime somebody comes out and says, a study has shown this, beware. That's one study. Give me 1,000 studies and then maybe I'll get impressed. The philosophical bone structure began to reappear ever more clearly as indispensable to the entire theological organism. In other words, what becomes evident the more that you study what Pius X was asking people to do is that the whole of theology is stabilized and made reasonable only when you have a solid philosophical substructure to it, especially metaphysics, and especially according to the doctrine, method, and principles of St. Thomas Aquinas, which is why the Church puts forth these 24 Theses as the distilled essence of what Thomism represents, essential to the maintenance of a solid dogmatic theology, essential to the maintenance of a solid pastoral theology, to a solid moral theology. If you strip away the metaphysical foundations, the whole thing becomes untenable. And this is what had happened, and this is what Pius X was trying to do, and that's why he says, in the next paragraph from Lagrange, the smallest departure from Aquinas, especially in metaphysics, brings in its wake great harm. I don't know which translation that is.
It's better.
And finally, it's a whole peck of trouble. Finally, he's talking about Cardinal Cajetan in his commentaries on the Summa. He says, Cajetan's glory lies in his recognition of the true grandeur of St. Thomas, of whom he willed to be the faithful commentator. Cajetan was trying to be a faithful commentator, not an innovator who was introducing his own deviant philosophy. This, here we go, this recognition was lacking in Suarez, who deserted the master lines of Thomistic metaphysics to follow his own personal thought. And here's the next point. Many a theologian on reaching the next world will realize that here below he failed to appreciate the grace which God bestowed on his church when he gave her the Doctor Communis, the common doctor, the angelic doctor, St. Thomas Aquinas. And you notice there isn't any doctor of the church named Suarez, just in passing. There are lots of others. Okay, we don't have time to proceed much more tonight, so we will get into the 24 Theses very shortly. And I think we may have already done them. I don't know. That's the difficulty of what we're doing right now.
Sound production copyright Oltine Library Services, all rights reserved. www.aquinasphilosophy.com